Mediation by nature is not competing with anyone, I guess.
Winner-takes-all litigation tends to poison relationships rather than mend them.
They can reach peaceful settlement under this kind of mediation, so this is more necessary than ever.
IOMed does not compete against ICSID or ICG for jurisdictions of international disputes.
IOMed, especially at its startup stage, can be best used for disputes like the trade disputes, climate change.
But I hope to goodness that they don't have all lawyers, because that's the greatest way to mess this thing up. It has to be populated, in my opinion, with people who are not from the 33 nations.
The Chat Lounge. Chat Lounge.
Chat Lounge.
The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
In a world increasingly divided, can diplomacy speak with a new voice? Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tianjn. With me to check how a newly established organization may contribute to international dispute settlement are Helen Han, co-founder and secretary general of the Beijing Club for International Dialogue, Bai Xianyue, partner of Grandall law firm Tianjin office, and Edward Lehman, founder and managing director of China-based law firm Lehman, Lee, and Xu. Thank you all for coming back to the show. So dozens of countries have joined China in establishing an international dispute resolution group. The International Organization for Mediation, or IOMed, promises to settle disputes not with judges and rulings, but with conversation and consensus, the first intergovernmental body of its kind. It'll be headquartered in Hong Kong and is due to open by the end of this year at the earliest. So it's an organization focused on mediation and dispute resolution, primarily through dialogue. And we have a guest here whose work surrounds international dialogue. So, Helen, what do you know about the organization and what's your interpretation of the timing of its establishment?
Thanks for having me. My understanding is that this IOMed was launched at a moment of this global power rebalancing or shifting, and also the legal dissatisfaction from China and other global South countries, and also the growing multipolarity. So this is the context or the background for the IOMed to be established, in my opinion. So it's simple, to understand its goal is to offer the sovereignty states, especially from the global South, a more neutral, peaceful, and inclusive platform for resolving disputes through mediation. I think mediation reflects the essence and the core spirit of dialogue. So we need to talk, we need to discuss, and we need to reach somewhat consent among the sovereign states before they bring this case or some disputes to a legal and a more professional institution or platform, so that two parties can be guided under the legal experts and the professional guidance, so that they can reach peaceful settlement under this kind of mediation. So this is more necessary than ever to have this kind of organization to be launched, especially when we uphold the essence of how global South can be more unified and can reach more consent over the disputes, so that people in these countries can have unified goals to reach the global prosperity, to global development, and to meet their each and every agenda of their states. So in summary, I think it at least offers some peaceful resolution platform for these international conflicts and to be guided under professional guidance. And also it can strengthen the global South's voices in international legal discourse. And also it can complement the existing institutions, not to replace them. But for example, the South China Sea dispute, it did not ask China's consent, but China was forced into this kind of disputes. But now the IOMed can offer a best practice case so that sovereign states can reach consensus at first to enter into this kind of settlement. So this is my understanding.
Right, how efficient it will be, and whether it's a complement or it's some, replacement, as some people would put it. We'll discuss a little later. But actually, preparation work for this organization has been undergoing for a couple of years in Hong Kong. So, Xianyue, why was Hong Kong chosen as the seat of IOMed?
Well, this is not surprising at all. Hong Kong has long been an international hub for international finance and dispute resolution over the past decades. Hong Kong is also very proud of its robust common law tradition and legal system. It has flexible rules and has also adopted the best practices of international legal dispute resolution. Hong Kong also boasts a large pool of bilingual, even trilingual legal experts who are well-versed in a variety of different legal jurisdictions and legal systems. And Hong Kong, not surprisingly, has become a key arbitration hub in Asia Pacific and beyond. Hong Kong also has the benefit that is unparalleled, I guess, against any other cities across the world. That is, it has the benefit of to be able to leverage its one country, two system advantage to solidify its role as a regional legal service center. Hong Kong has also become an ideal choice for international parties to select as their seat of dispute resolution. And it also has the benefit of easy enforcement whenever there's an award, there's a decision, or interim measures to be enforced, etc. So if we have to choose a place for the international organization for mediation, Hong Kong is definitely the best choice. And Hong Kong has already a large number of international organizations in Hong Kong. So this is something I think everybody expects, really.
And Ed, as some international legal business practitioner, do you agree with Xianyue in this regard?
I do agree with what he said. It's interesting about Hong Kong. It was handed over in 1997. It's based in common law. The issue, I think, there is that it's a relatively small pool of barristers. There's about 500, and there's maybe 5,000 solicitors. So the actual body of people who, solicitors don't necessarily have the right of audience. With mediation, one does not have to be admitted before the courts in Hong Kong to be able to mediate. So that's good. That means people like a lawyer Bai can do it, or Helen could do it. So anyone can actually do it. You don't have to be a lawyer necessarily to mediate a case. Mediation has been around for a long time. A lot of people mix it up with meditation, but it's far from both of those. Mediation, so the Hong Kong International Arbitration Commission, or even CTAC, which is the largest arbitration body in the world, has mediation. So that's been a part of it. What's different about this Hong Kong group is that it was floated, as Helen and lawyer Bai talked about, in 2019 through a Friends of Mediation group, and in 2021, and then it was crystallized. I think back in Hong Kong, they had actually changed some of the legislation, and Singapore's changed legislation to allow what has been bound by mediation to be recognized across the border. So, that's what's kind of important with this particular thing. So mediation is everywhere. So, I was doing a case in the Second Circuit, which is New York City, Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and they had us in mandatory mediation between the parties. They have a mediator, which is kind of like a referee, but really it's the parties are on there and talking to one another, at least in this particular case. I did not find it particularly helpful, but it's mandatory to do it. What's interesting, I think, about this particular body, this IOMed, is that they're making it just a sole body that's dedicated to that. So all these other arbitration bodies, whether it's the Tianjn arbitration body, or whether it's the one in Shanghai, or one in Hong Kong, or CTEC in Beijing or Hong Kong, they all have mediation as an option. But this is something different that is set up just for mediation, and then states are signing up for it. Again, we were talking earlier about some of the history with regards to law in China. And, the reason CTEC is the most busy arbitration body in the world was when people first came into China, there were these recommended contracts that actually indicated you had to use CTEC. And almost everybody, and this goes back into the 80s and early 90s, the enterprises were nervous about, they didn't generally have legal counsel, but they were nervous about doing contracts that didn't have that arbitration clause in there. So that actually catapulted it and made CTAC the busiest arbitration body in the world. What they've done in this case is they had a bunch of states that have signed up. This IOMed is actually going to be different. It's going to be, folks are, what I can tell, are going to have sort of diplomatic immunity or some sort of diplomatic status when they're doing this. And this is a state-sponsored, and it's exactly what Helen talked about. Let's talk about solving problems rather than building walls. It's also talking about shifting the dispute resolution to China and have influence across the world because folks are signing up for it. And it's a good idea. And it's just the issue is going to be in implementing this.
Right. We'll discuss that later on. But you all mentioned there are some advantages that Hong Kong holds here. But to the organization itself, it only got some a little over 30 founding member states. That's less than 1/6 of the world's countries and how an organization, how effective or how influential it can be, obviously depends, to some extent, depends on how many members it got, right? So can IOMed have global influence, Ed?
Yeah, it can. Okay, so let's take the New York Convention. So the New York Convention of 1958 is the convention that oversees arbitration bodies. Now, arbitration bodies can be set up, except for China, by the way, can be set up by anybody. I mean, Mr. Bai and I can set up an arbitration body in Hong Kong under the New York Convention. China is a little bit different. I know Hong Kong happens to be China, and it's another reason why it's that one country, two systems, and it works better there. First of all, they have a fully convertible currency in Hong Kong. In mainland, it becomes a bit more challenged to be able to do it. Second, mediation actually lends itself to the common law or equity. So equity was when the king, and this comes from the United Kingdom, and the United States adapted it, and Hong Kong, of course, and other Commonwealth places have adapted it, when the king would actually sit there with this mace, this sort of stick in its hand, and would decide disputes between parties. A lot of these parties, and is what we're dealing with today with digital currencies, with what's climate change and whether something's green enough, has to be decided. It's not necessarily done by a civil law system where you're dotting the T's and crossing the I's. It's actually done in a more equitable situation where someone wise, hopefully, decides the decision about how things are to be interpreted. So let's take the New York Convention. So it started out in 1958 with 20 members. I'm sorry, it started out with 10 members, and now it binds 172. So, I mean, that's a long time, 1958. What do we got, 66 years. But then you've got the ICSID convention, which began with 20 members and today covers 158. I think that people who want to do business, the inaugural roster is got Pakistan, Indonesia, and a lot of ASEAN countries. You've got Belarus, you've got Serbia and Cuba, Nicaragua. For Latin America, you've got Gabon and Ethiopia representing Africa. So I think with anything, one has to look at what's the most difficult thing to break. And in physics, we know it's stasis. Once something that stays still tends to stay still. Once something gets moving, then it tends to continue to move. And I think the idea of getting these different countries in different parts of the world that are supporting this will get this thing moving. And, it's a clever and positive start from, an outside observer. So.
I didn't expect such a big affirmation from a lawyer. And Xianyue, your interpretation here?
Okay, yeah, I agree with, I completely concur with what Lehman just said. IOM, what I call IOM, the International Organization for Mediation, or IOMed, whatever you call it, it certainly starts in a humble way with only 30 members at the moment, most of which are from developing countries for apparent reasons. And well, it certainly looks a bit impressive with the prospect hard to predict. The potential for its growth is not to be underestimated, just as Lehman just now said. Of course, nothing is guaranteed at this point. We have to acknowledge the challenges for IOM to develop and extend to an eminent status comparable to that of, for example, International Court of Justice or ICSID. Lehman mentioned that as well, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. Anytime soon. I mean, the chances of attaining that status anytime soon is rather slim. It takes a long time to really grow into a status at that with an international global influence. But as Lehman just now mentioned, you have to bear in mind the fact that ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, which has now 150 contracting states now, handling more than 300 cases last year. But it's been around for 60 years. Yeah. ICC is the same case. ICC has been around for 78 years already. So it also has a global influence. And apart from that, both ICSID and ICG, for example, is one of the 6 organs of United Nations. So it is born with an international influence, being part of the United Nations. ICSID is the same thing. So for international organization or mediation, to grow into that status, it definitely takes a long time. And we have to be realistic about that.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
And Helen, actually, most IOMed signatories come from developing countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. So does this shape or limit, if you will, the organization's role or reach in any way?
Certainly, it does have some, narrative on its own from the very beginning. I think we have a very good discussion regarding the size of this startup, if I may call it a startup in the global governance. I think it's actually fills the crucial gap of being a neutral state-to-state mediation body rooted in this consent and mutual respect. And also, it's not a problem for its size, especially from the very beginning. I did my fair research, just add on to what Edward Lehman and Professor Bai said. Many of these kind of international bodies started as a small size, like the WTO started with GATT, begin with just the 23 countries, or the European Coal and Steel Community started with only 6 members. So the size is not a problem at all, and also not necessarily for the signing parties or from developing countries or developing regions. I really regard it as it's not about having all countries right now. It's not about having both developed countries or developing countries. It's about solving some specific problems, solving some pressing matters facing developing countries, particularly because developing countries need something to be more neutral and to show the respect to their urgent needs when facing the state-to-state conflicts or potential disputes. For example, I still clearly remembered almost 1 year and a half, the former Secretary of State of the United States, Antony Blinken, said something, a famous quote saying that if you are not on the table, you will be in the menu, something like that. So I regard IOMed as a peaceful and neutral table for all the developing countries. So it's more like a global South peace table. So everybody can sit on the table if they have some potential mediate disputes, but they can start with IOMed on equal footing. They can be free from the power imbalances often seen in traditional international legal forums. So this gives global South countries, when they face the economic and the social and the political development agenda, they kind of get a break or a free forum they can utilize, and that they can utilize without any concern or pressure from the partners, the potential partners or competitors that will give them pressure. So this is very, very unique, and this is what they urgently needed for their potential disputes. And also it can be a bridge builder between systems, especially between many legal traditions and the new traditions are forming under this global power shifting and under the formation of the multipolar world. So this is more importantly than the size or the signing bodies, as long as it has certain representation and as long as it can start building a track record of solving or mediating the disputes from a fair, equal footing or point of view, and as long as it can provide some real case solution to these potentially having disputes countries, I think it will grow.
As you mentioned, there are a lot of advantages, or especially for developing countries. But some people would also question whether this kind of advantages or strength, if you will, would also risk protracted or inconclusive negotiations. So, Xianyue, as a lawyer, do you truly believe in such a method of dispute settlement?
Well, mediation can be time-consuming. It's not always, I have to say, unfortunately, as effective as you would expect. The mediation, apart from what we have known, I guess we discussed this a little bit at the onset of this session. Mediation is something additional as a means of dispute resolution to arbitration, to the traditional litigation that is part of the proceeding of the legal systems. Mediation is largely based on voluntary consent from both parties that are involved in any dispute. So sometimes it can be time-consuming, takes a long time, particularly for litigation, because it has its own set of rules and procedures to go through before any decision can be made. So you have a kind of a fixed set of a time frame that you have to go through to finish before the proceeding can come to an official end, or before we can get anything that is binding and legally enforceable. In the case of a mediation, the process can be very different. It's largely, again, as I said, based on a set of rules that is agreed upon by the parties beforehand. So mediation, in my practice, or according to my understanding, rarely takes that long because the parties basically are free to withdraw from the proceeding anytime they want.
Indeed.
Yeah, because it's purely on a voluntary basis. And you have to also bear in mind the successful rate of any mediation is rather slim or rather small. You don't have a whole lot of cases that can be mediated successfully. So you don't always have a successful result as from the perspective of the mediator, I guess. So the process won't necessarily be that long as you would see happening in legal proceedings, in litigation, arbitration. Again, they have a fixed set of rules and time frame you have to finish. But for mediation, the case of mediation, simply because of the fact that a large number of mediation cases, even if the parties are willing to submit a dispute to a mediation center or mediation agency or institution, whatever you call it, the success rate is rather low, I have to say. So that is basically the parties can end the proceeding right away if they don't see any hope of successfully resolving the dispute, or they simply find it a waste of time, for example. So you don't have an authority to impose it on them, any rules or any time frame or any proceeding and procedure, etc. So that is a challenge for mediation.
Are you saying it's maybe sometimes more flexible and more, efficient?
Well, efficiency not in the sense of that you can achieving a satisfactory result for the parties, or from the perspective of the mediation institution. The parties might decide to completely work out. I mean, that's the end of it. It's a waste of time. They might make a decision that after a few hours or a few days they decide there's no point of continuing this process. So in that sense, it can be efficient. It doesn't take that long. It doesn't consume that much time. Well, the reason is simply because they don't see any hope or any value in putting more time or effort into this process.
And I got some figures here. IOMed and mediation agreements are not legally binding per se, but they can be, implemented as commercial contracts or under domestic law. And in 2024, 89% of mediation outcomes in Hong Kong were reportedly enforced. And in contrast, while judgments by, some institutions like the International Court of Justice are legally binding, their enforcement rate has remained as low as 20% since 1966. So, Ed, does that make this method of mediation probably more efficient or more satisfactory? What's your take here?
My take is that I'm optimistic. I agree with Lawyer Bai that as a practical matter, at least being involved in mediation in the United States, being involved in mediation in China, it has not been, for me personally and for my clients, has not been super successful. So, and that's interesting because you've got both U.S. problems and you've got China-related problems. Part of that is there's the rules, so-called rules, like Lawyer Bai said, that it has to be voluntary, of course. I mean, in certain places, they assign a mediator to the group, and then that person can be either very switched on and connected and pushing people to try to resolve this and set up meetings and discussions, or not. And then the other thing that no one really talks about here, but as a lawyer, and Lawyer Bai can speak about this themselves, sometimes lawyers get in the way of mediation because they don't really understand it. It wasn't something we necessarily learned in law school or certainly in the places I've taught in China. I've not seen mediation as a course in China. Maybe there is one now, but and certainly I was not seeing that. There would be arbitration, mediation, very, kind of vague thing. What I'm encouraged about here is that legislatively in Hong Kong, the mediation ordinance of 2017, it grants near absolute privilege to mediation communications, which mirrors Article 26 of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. So that's good. And so it gives, and like you were saying, that this can get enforced. And this is sort of the mechanics of it. There's a contract, the mediation can end in a contract, then the contract can be, parties can agree to it, it can be confidential, or the Hong Kong courts can enforce mediated settlements under what's the Singapore Convention. This is kind of the guts of what's going on. But where I've been disappointed, and my clients have been disappointed in mediation, is where things are not transparent and things are very difficult to interpret. So what I'm saying is that my hope is, what I think they're trying to accomplish in Hong Kong is to have a consistent and transparent set of rules. And like I said, it's not just, it's the Second Circuit in New York Federal District Court for the Federal Court of Appeals that is as problematic as the Beijing Fourth Intermediate People's Court. So it's universal with that. I don't think it has to do with the government or with the legal system. It just has to do with the people who are implementing these things. And what I see with IOMed is an opportunity to be the only organization that's strictly looking at mediation and is saying folks should participate in it, and they're going to have these transparent rules, which nobody knows fully what they will be. We can guess, but until it sort of goes into implementation. And, I think, what was it, Sun Tzu said that, amidst all the chaos, there's some opportunity. And certainly Marcus Aurelius, he said, that which is the stumbling block to the way becomes the way. And so I think that that's what we have with IOMed, that there's a possibility that this can be something very useful and very unique, and it can be led by China, and not just for third world countries, but for other countries. And there's places, just double back here, where China and the United States, we don't have reciprocity between judicial judgments that are in the United States and in China. We don't have a convention or a MLAT, which is this multilateral agreement, but treaty between the two countries to enforce judgments from the United States into China or China into the United States. This is problematic for people. Now, it's been done about 12 different times. It's done all the time with regards to family law matters, adoptions, marriages, divorces, but there's no real structure in place. What I'm saying is it's something like this, and then you just have to look at reciprocity on these individual cases. Like I said, the 12 kind of key cases that have happened where there's been enforcement in China, been enforcement in the United States, and then you go to Beijing Fourth Intermediate Court or wherever it is, and you say, hey, let's enforce this judgment. So what this offers with IOMed is an opportunity to have there be international recognition of these mediation settlements, and it could be a new way. Yeah, that's the hope.
Indeed, we need obviously we need some more specific or details of how they can implement such a resolution. Maybe it's because of what you just mentioned. Things are sometimes vague. They're trying to define the cases they would accept with some prerequisites, if you will. So let's take a look at the organization's primary focus.
But that's when we come back.
Sideline Story brings you all things sports related. The hottest topics, latest events, juiciest stories, all with a very personal take. Subscribe to Sideline Story Podcast for heated sports discussions covering events that are happening in China and around the world.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat on the newly established International Organization for Mediation, or IOMed. IOMed is designed to address, according to its website, state-to-state, investor-state, and international commercial disputes. And it states that pursuant to the IOMed Convention, the IOMed provides mediation services for disputes between states submitted by mutual consent. And a concerned state must not exclude the dispute through a declaration and not involving a third state unless that third state gives prior consent. It's a little bit tongue-twisting to me. So probably, Xianyue, you can explain it in layman's terms and why IOMed makes this a prerequisite.
Well, I guess the idea, here, to have a clause like this, basically an express requirement to ensure that any dispute to be submitted to the IOMed is completely out of voluntary agreement by the state parties. Mutual consent of the state parties is an absolute prerequisite. And additionally, IOMed wants to make sure that it won't infringe upon state sovereignty or give rise to any further disputes in relation to any dispute resolution proceedings. So that basically, if any state party, for example, issues a declaration that is, it will not be subject to this particular dispute, will not be subject to the jurisdiction of IOMed, then IOMed will basically say, it's not within my jurisdiction. It's not something that I will handle. Or if there's any dispute, IOMed, before ascertains its jurisdiction, it has to obtain the prior consent from that particular party. So the downside of this particular requirement, I guess, there are legal consequences to this. It is multifaceted. For example, one of them being, it is intended to prevent any legal dispute regarding jurisdiction or minimize the chances of any new additional dispute. But in the meantime, the other legal consequence could be, it might give rise to a risk of being unpredictable, and also it might undermine the legitimacy of jurisdiction sometimes for interim measures as well, or any award to be issued by the tribunal whenever there's a challenge or whatever that comes up at a later stage, or any declaration made after the case was accepted, for example, whatever. I mean, there would be challenges to sort out because of this requirement.
Well, some people say that IOMed is a strategic move by China to create an alternative that's more favorable to its position in the South China Sea. So, Xianyue, based on what you just mentioned, is it likely for China to do so, or it's very unlikely for such a case to be brought to IOMed?
Well, this idea of international mediation, I guess, is really a result. I guess it's part of the overall the Chinese alternative way of resolving international disputes with, an emphasis or commitment to the traditional sort of a Chinese value of peacemaking, of maintaining harmony.
Yeah. I mean, you just mentioned it has to get the consent from both sides or multi parties. So it's kind of unlikely that the Philippines, they will agree that China brings this case to IOMed, or they settle the dispute with China at IOMed or through mediation, right?
Yeah. Then, yes, it takes mutual consent.
Right. Then what kind of cases or issues will be brought to IOMed? Who would be their clients then?
I guess I would be, cautious in terms of how successful this IOMed will be in the short term. First of all, this is a great question, which is being asked by many, I guess. When it comes to dispute resolution institutions, this is nothing unusual at the inception stage of a new international institution. As I said just now, ICSID started, more than 60 years ago with only a handful of members, and ICG, when it started back in 1946, there are only, there were not a whole lot of cases at all. So the same thing applies to IOMed. It would not be surprising if IOMed does not have any or very limited cases submitted to it for the first few years. This was the case for many international institutions. But of course, IOMed should make an effort to review its purpose, its mission. In the meantime, update the roles and mechanism, constantly sort of update and bring up to speed with the latest developments of the international community, etc. And it takes a whole lot of different mechanism, roles, management, to be a successful and to be competitive international dispute resolution institution. Not every dispute resolution institution involving state members will have a chance to flourish. So IOMed is apparently the institution that is going to be parallel to the other international institutions currently existing, which are under the umbrella of the United Nations, which certainly enjoys the benefit of having easy access to those international parties, those international institutions. So IOMed will be probably taking a different course, but it takes time.
Right. And also the same question to Helen and Ed. Helen, what's your expectation? Probably you can give us some examples of who would bring disputes to IOMed. I think you mentioned things like the dispute over South China Sea, but
I mentioned South China Sea case because South China Sea arbitration back in 2016 was a very interesting case because at that time, the Philippines brought this case against China using the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and challenging China's 9-line claims in the South China Sea. And China totally refused to participate in the arbitration and later issued a declaration in 2016 because China used this, the UNCLOS Article 298, I think, excluding the disputes concerning maritime delimitation from compulsory arbitration. So the UNCLOS is very interesting. Under same article, like 298, China can use this article to exclude the disputes concerning the maritime, the sovereignty. But Philippines can use this article 2 to claim the arbitration. So this is like a very vivid example of excluding a dispute through a declaration. So that's why IOMed, set the prerequisites for the mutual consent for the states to enter into mediation. Only the two states enter into this mediation have to have this consent in the first place. So the arbitration back in 2016 on the South China Sea actually is without China's consent. So China rejected the ruling. But in the IOMed case, if China and the Philippines, before entering into this kind of mediation, can reach some consensus and then to discuss some technical issues under the IOMed, I think that's more feasible than the International Court of Arbitration. But further understanding of this IOMed mission and its role and responsibility, we want to reach the peaceful, discussion, dialogue, peaceful settlement for a potential conflicts between states. I think IOMed, especially at its startup stage, can be best used for disputes like the trade disputes, climate change or other pressing issues, but not that sovereignty issues related, in my opinion, because these kind of trade disputes or some other disputes in this can help complement the current institutions' lack, especially the current institutions are under the so-called Western narrative. So the IOMed, birthplace in Hong Kong, established by most developing countries, it has its own identity and the narrative shaped by the future cases it deals with or it will deal with, mostly still, like I said, to provide or offer a peaceful negotiation and a peaceful resolution table for the legitimate sovereign states, but on the disputes that can move the development for both states. So in this case, if the IOMed can be used for this kind of trade disputes, instead of using WTO, for example, which is almost dominated or paralyzed by United States. So the IOMed can move in this direction and can offer some alternative solution for the developing states. It certainly faces challenges, but it can provide alternative solutions.
Right. And Ed, what's your expectation?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's going to be, maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think it's going to be a very big success. I mean, and I think Helen hit it right on the head. I mean, that in that particular case with the South China Sea, and I think you can do South China Sea. I mean, if you take a look at some of the members, there's 32 members, and that I can find. One is Timor-Leste. They're located in Kiribati and Solomon Islands. So there are some guys in the South China Sea or in that neighborhood, let's put it that way. And you can bring some action. And this is what sort of happened when China said, we're not going to recognize that arbitration. But the other side got a lot of publicity with regards to that judgment. And it was a political success for them. And it was a challenge for the Chinese in that particular situation, because they're saying, okay, this august body, whatever it is coming out with this judgment. And so I think that this goes back to what Helen said in the beginning. This kind of balances the framework where there is this body that is made up of 32 different countries, which includes, Indonesia, which is a very large country, for example. You've got those in Africa and, Papua New Guinea. You've got in Serbia and in Central Europe, Uganda, Vanuatu, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Cambodia. So you've got some kind of motion going on here. This group can have a mediation. They can come up with some decisions. And this third party, let's pretend it was the Philippines, can say, well, we don't agree with that decision that came out of that mediation, which included these nations. It's still kind of a political win. Not everything is about what the courtroom decides. I mean, International Court of Justice is a great example of that. Some folks think that Mr. Netanyahu should, be tried for crimes against humanity, and other people think he's a great guy. So this is a political platform as well as a platform that hopefully is going to serve a purpose. And I think it'll be a success for China from day one, even with this lineup on doing different types of things. And I don't know what the future holds, but folks may bring things to mediation to different nations. For example, Pakistan happens to be in this group here, and Pakistan and India don't get along with each other particularly, as we've seen recently. And so there may be some nations getting together, mediating some kind of settlement, which would include a third party, which might be India, India says, I don't want to participate in. Now, do they win? The answer is no. But do they win in the publicity and in public relations? Yes, they do. And so I think that that's part of what this is about. It's not always about necessarily winning the case and having a final outcome, but it's kind of balancing the power. And I agree with everybody who said that we're going to gain momentum, and then this thing will become something that'll be a tour de force. I have no doubt about it. When China decides to put its resources, and these countries, no matter how big or small that they are, into something like this, it will be an amazing success. And again, it's not just about the percentage of cases that are solved through mediation, but this is going to act as some kind of a bridge, hopefully, that will be able to bridge some of these controversies that are going on around the world today.
I can see you are an optimist, but there is a renowned saying goes, never expect to get at the negotiation table what you can't get on the battlefield.
Right. No, I agree. But there are, just to answer your question from before, so there are specific cases. So maritime overlap cases, for example, the Guyana, Suriname fisheries management, stalled since 2007, and then Annex 7 of the arbitration, could benefit from a confidential fisheries protocol brokered by IOMed. Climate finance allocation disputes between small island states that are members versus donor blocks over loss and damage to funding, and mediation can bridge scientific method disagreements faster probably than the UN FCCC plenaries. Infrastructure disputes in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, which are all members over hydropower cascades in the Mekong mainstream, where the Mekong River Commission lacks the enforcement lever, can be a good use straight away. Post-conflict reconstruction packages in Armenia and Azerbaijan, transport corridor guarantees, bundling rail link and demining and prisoner exchange provisions into one mediated instrument can be done by this group, for example, straight away. But I think people need to see this, and it's hard if you're not looking for it. But the common denominator will be like high politics plus kind of a technical complexity terrain where winner-takes-all litigation tends to poison relationships rather than mend them. So I think in those particular cases, tomorrow they can find some kind of solution, and people are participating right now in the countries I just mentioned. So that would be a huge success. If someone has enough vision to actually plug these things in right away, then I think you can get the momentum to make this a real credible organization. It's not just like what'll happen in the future, who knows? It depends on whether they lie flat or they decide to get moving.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Helen, you were saying?
Well, I'm so happy that Edward Lehman, offered so many vivid potential cases that can be solved by IOMed. I'm really glad at hearing that because, those are really great potential conflicts because of the geopolitical turbulence and down the road. So it is so important to have such a mediation institution rather than arbitration, rather than the traditional judicial system to deal with that. And it proves that from the Gaza crisis or the other conflicts that the current judicial international system or institutions failed to comply with their mission and vision and failed to have some resolution or solution for the conflicts. So it's really good to have an organization supported and hosted by China and other global South countries, developing countries, to uphold the mission and to carry the torch of peaceful resolution and alternative solutions. I believe the wisdom of human beings. So it is a great timing and the place in Hong Kong to have this kind of alternative resolution for the potential conflicts. So we need to do them in advance. I'm hearing India and Pakistan. I'm hearing potential Indonesia when it's entering a new development stage, its potential disputes with other neighboring countries within ASEAN or beyond ASEAN, many stuff. So it's really adding a multilateral state-to-state mediation function. It's very crucial to the Global South development and to the dialogue between Global South and North.
Yeah, sure.
I can add something additional to what has been discussed, what has been mentioned by the other two commentators just now. Mediation by this International Organization for Mediation, what we call IOMed, does not preclude the jurisdiction of ICSID, for example, the International Center for Settlement of International Investment Disputes, or International Court of Justice, or other methods. And no party is obliged to relinquish its commitment or signatory obligations under other international treaty, on the parallel international treaties. So IOMed is simply another parallel proceeding made available to the parties in search of an effective dispute resolution. So simply put, there's no string attached, no catch, whatever, no other restrictions attached to this obligation being part of this IOMed organization. So IOMed does not compete against ICSID or ICG for jurisdictions of international disputes. On the contrary, IOMed probably, to a certain extent, will facilitate the process of a dispute resolution by providing a flexible proceeding in which the parties are still free to resort to other means. And also IOMed could be an experiment to experiment with other different ways of doing things of dispute resolution. To a certain extent, it could be an interesting and effective experiment as well.
So you don't think it's some challenge to the existing international judicial system, as some, I would say, Indian media would put it?
No, absolutely not. And mediation by nature is not competing with anyone, I guess. Mediation is simply a purely voluntary process the parties choose to try. I mean, if mediation does not succeed, the parties are still, within their, choices, and they're still free to check out other options, for example, arbitration, for example, litigation, or As I said, international court of justice or investment-related disputes, you have exit as well. So this is an additional layer of choice. The state parties simply have one more choice on their hand to check out, and hopefully dispute will be resolved in a more efficient and cost-effective way.
Seems the future is bright, but the road ahead is quite curvy or tough to some extent. But going forward, like you all mentioned, that in its nascent stage, maybe things would be a little bit difficult and the organization won't be that influential. So going forward, how can IOMed become more influential, if you will, globally? I want suggestions from all of you. Maybe Xianyue first.
Well, this is not going to be an easy task or any objective that can be achieved, within the coming few years. It's definitely going to be a long process. Again, as I said, looking back at the history of the current existing, successful, what we call international organization for international dispute resolution, for example, ICSID is a great example, and ICG, for example. They all have the benefit that IOMed can never compete against. For example, they are being under the umbrella of United Nations. And it took them more than 60 years. In case of ICG, 70, almost 80 years to be what it is now. China does not have that much experience, I guess, in operating a successful international organization, particularly for a peacemaking, for dispute resolution mechanism. IOMed has still a lot to learn from other existing international organizations. For the international dispute resolution to be successful, there are so many different things we have to be aware of. There are so many things we need to learn from other institutions. For example, international dispute resolution organization, it has to be able to maintain transparency, for example. It has to have an effective set of rules that are able to take into account the different needs of the parties, a clear procedure, efficient procedure. And you need to also have a list of competent mediators as well. And you need to be diversified. You need to be inclusive of different legal jurisdictions, different legal practices in different countries, because the parties are expected to come from all over the place. You need to have experts who are familiar with the best practice of international dispute resolution. And you need to have an efficient and capable of secretary. You need to have really outstanding staff members to facilitate the whole process, etc. So there are so many different things we need to be aware of. There's so many things we need to catch up. And we need to learn from other existing international best practices and institutions.
Right. I think great lawyers with a strong capability of mediation are in great need there. And Ed, what would be your suggestion, and what kind of challenges do you actually foresee for this organization going forward?
Yeah, I will echo and agree with Lawyer Bai said, and that certainly this is going to be a challenge, but one that China is able to meet. There's been names tossed around. Dr. Sun Jin is, sort of effectively the acting Secretary General of the organization. He's a career diplomat and a mediator who chaired all 5 treaty drafting rounds and was installed, by consensus by the preparatory office. So that's kind of in place. They've also got a fellow called Rimsky-Yuen, former Hong Kong Secretary of Justice, and then Teresa Chung, who's a, SC, Silk Council is what it stands for. So, and then they've got someone from mainland, Li Miao, and then a person from Nigeria. So this is the thing, that the way that it works here is that there's going to have a panel of mediators, and that's exactly what Larry Bai talked about, and Helen's talked about it as well. Who's going to come in and be these folks? So there's 4 mediators that would come from each of those nations. So you can take 32 times 4, and then 2 of them have to come from your country, and then 2 of them can come from another country, and they're renewable for 5-year terms. So at least 2 must not be nationals of your state. And so you have to take outside people, which I think is kind of cool, because if you could bring in some other folks, like, people who are fair, mediators from these other nations. Remember, we're not talking about a small group of people. You have Indonesia. I think it's the 3rd largest by population country in the world. Nigeria, which could be one of the top countries in the world as far as population is concerned. And so if you would take some folks from other nations that aren't in there yet, this is kind of how you can grow it. And it's, it's a challenge, but I think that people are up for it. I also think how they can succeed is if they make it more niche and professional with regards to, what these folks are discussing. So there would be different things about, cryptocurrencies or digital currencies or blockchain, or what to do about AI. But I think they're actively scouting lawyers and ADR professionals, that's alternative dispute representative resolution professionals, from all these states. I think they're going to have tougher times from Vanuatu, from Solomon Islands, from Timor-Leste. Of course, Timor-Leste is like the second newest country in the world. South Sudan, I think, is the newest. Only Sudan and not South Sudan are a part of it. But I think that there are challenges here. But in those challenges, they will come up with some really great things, like a Nelson Mandela, like, some kind of thing that we haven't seen for quite some time might be able to come out of this organization. But I think what China did, which was with AIIB in the banking side, was that they tried to make it, obviously they were sort of leading it, and Asia Development Bank was United States and Japan. But it has to be populated, in my opinion, with people who are not from the 33 nations, and maybe from nations that not are adverse, but nations that there are friendly people from all nations that are friendly to China. And I think they need to find those people, and they have to be kind of above the fracas and the fray. And those people participating, I think, would be very helpful. And I think they know this. And I think it'll be an unmitigated success. It's just a question of who calls it an unmitigated success. If it's the media, if it's the population, who knows? But I think those are some things that they can take a look at to make this thing a success. But also, with the rule writing, that's super important. So sometimes as lawyers, we understand the rules, and you can either play the rule book or play your counsel. And sometimes you have to play the rule book. You have to find out what the heck the rules are. Right. To be able to participate effectively.
And Helen, as someone specialized in dialogue or international dialogue, what would be your suggestions?
Well, we have many special senior fellows or special experts actually from the diplomatic compound, the community, as well as from the academic community. So I'm happy Edward brought about the case in AIIB about the leadership composition. So it's a very good comparison that the most recent news is that the former UK ambassador to China is named the next VP, Vice President of AIIB, succeeding her predecessors from UK. So this is a very good case in point, stating that we do not only need the legal professionals. Legal professionals that certainly are cornerstones and foundation, as Edward just mentioned about play by the rulebook. These are the foundation and cornerstone of IOMed, not only for AIIB. But then above that, I think we need the personnel or talents from the diplomatic community as well as from the academic community, so that we know the landscape of the geopolitical tensions, and we know the priorities, if not all, but some regional countries, some representative countries, especially the signing parties of these 33 countries. So what are their priorities? What are the potential conflicts might be? So these people are not only executioners at the end of or mediators when there are cases, but also in the first place, they are the good listeners, and they are really good experts on knowing the macro change, the macro geopolitical tensions or the context. And then they can understand the development or evolution of these potential disputes or the development of these cases, so that it can deliver value, remain impartial, but also attract real cases with those willing parties. So they can be good listeners, they can be good mediators, and they can also bring the real piece to the table.
The one thing I just want to say, I hope to goodness that they don't have, I agree with you, that they don't have all lawyers, because that's the greatest way to mess this thing up. And I say that with all respect. Okay. Yeah. Because I hope they take diplomats and they take people from outside of the society. Yeah. Lawyers are great, but the problem is that they let law and all this stuff get in the way of solving some problems, I think. And I'm as guilty as anybody, but I'm just saying I see it all the time. Lawyers kind of put their hand on the scale. So I hope they get people that are diplomats. And I also think that they need to get people who will bring in cases right away. So diplomats know what some of this stuff is, former diplomats. Yeah, and that's why, like you see with AIIB, I do think that was a really good example, not one I thought of, but just in general of how China's made this not all about China. And it's really important that they make it not all about China. And that's where the success will come.
Fair enough. Well said. And that brings us to the end of our chat for this session. Many thanks to Helen Han, co-founder and Secretary General of the Beijing Club for International Dialogue, Edward Lehman, founder and managing director of China-based law firm Lehman, Lee & Xu, and Bai Xianyue, partner of Grandall law firm Tianjn office, for sharing your insights. The show is available on all major podcast platforms. Please email us your comments at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tianjn. Thank you for listening. Join us again next week for more chat at the Chat Lounge. Until then, take care.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the Art of War will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.